Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about The Larnachs by Owen Marshall. So this is a novel picking up on the story of William Larnach. I've made a bunch of videos about histories and a play about William Larnach, and particularly I am interested in his suicide because no one knows why he killed himself in 1898 in Committee Room J of the New Zealand Parliament building. And so I've been working on an article about the historiography of how Larnach's life, and particularly his last days, have been narrated. Unlike the histories by people like A.H. Reid, Hardwicke Knight, Fleur Snedden, Marshall is writing a novel. And so, as he says in the sort of disclaimer, this is not a biography and not a history. It is a novel, the imaginative interpretation of a situation experienced by real people. So that's very important because what Marshall does that, as far as I can tell, no other biography or fictionalized version of William Larnach's story does, is he does not focus on William Larnach himself. He focuses on the other two people in the main, at this point, sort of main accepted theory of why Larnach killed himself. That is Constance, William Larnach's third wife, Constance DeBath Brandon. I don't know why I can never remember her full name. Constance DeBath Brandon, who was about half Larnach's age when they married. He was I think in his early 60s. She was in her early 30s, and she was his third wife. I think I mentioned that. That's important. And William's second son, Douglas, who was in his early to mid-20s around the time. There's a theory promoted seemingly largely by perhaps disgruntled members of William's family and their extended family, their children and grandchildren, that Constance, or Conny, as she's known, and Douglas, or Dougie, as Constance calls him in this novel, that they had an affair, and that William found out about it, and that was the basis of his suicide. It's possible. There is no hard evidence, documentary evidence, etc., to support this theory. It is based in the testimony of family members who themselves had a pretty compelling reason to be displeased with Conny and Douglas. So I think there are reasons to be skeptical about it, but for the purposes of fiction, people like Michelle Ann Foster, whose play Larnach treats it as fact, and Marshall, whose novel The Larnachs treats it as fact, perfectly fine, right? In a fictionalized version, you can do what you want. And in fact, Marshall does. So basically what he does is what the scholar Jeremy Rawson calls minor character elaboration. So we don't know much about Conny, her view of the world, how she saw herself, how she experienced her marriage, what, if anything, motivated her to have an affair with her stepson, if that really happened, etc., etc. We don't know. We don't have Douglas's perspective on any of this stuff. And so, historians, again, people like Reid, Knight, and Snedden, tend to be pretty silent on the subject. They speculate a little bit about the nature of their relationships with William, like Hardwicke Knight says that based on his research, he thinks that they had quite a happy marriage, at least for the first few years, and then other things sort of happened that drove William into depression, etc., etc. So, we do get some speculation. but Marshall gives us their perspectives. We have here alternating chapters, alternating between Connie's perspective and Dougie's perspective. And what this does as minor character elaboration is it takes these two characters who are, in this case, central to the story, but who don't themselves have their stories told, and it tells their story, right? So this is a way of empowering characters who are traditionally peripheral within literary, or in this case, historical narratives. As Rosen points out, there are big problems with this in that it is not actually giving voice to Conny or Douglas. It is reconstructing what a contemporary author from a position of cultural authority thinks their voices might have sounded like. And so there is a degree of imposition there that continues. So like the idea that often drives minor character elaboration, particularly for feminist or post-colonial, critical race, LGBT, whatever it is, purposes, is to give voice to characters who've been silenced. As Rosen points out, that does not necessarily happen as such. But again, that's basically Marshall's project here, right? Is this novel is meant to give Conny and Douglas perspectives, voices, self-representation in a way that other narratives of the Larnachs do not. Now, all that being said, I actually don't find the novel that compelling, in part because I think I don't know if I think it's clumsy in its approach or if I just personally didn't like it, but the first-person perspectives read very much like diary entries, even though they're not set up in that way. Just the approach is so sort of, I'm recording my thoughts, and these are the people that came to our house recently, and I like these people of them, but I don't really like those people. I won't be inviting them back. Instead, I'll be inviting these other people because they hold this view and whatever. And like, okay, so we're getting interiority, right? We're getting a degree of how does this character look at the world, etc., etc. And some of those things are revelatory, right? So, like, there's this one bit that I actually found really, really interesting. Because one of the things is we don't know that much about Conny and her political views, her perspectives, her ideas, etc., etc. But we have this bit where early in the marriage, she and William discuss their political views. William was a politician on and off. He held a number of different seats, a number of different government positions, etc., etc. And I think the political values that she ascribes to each of them, or that Marshall ascribes to each of these characters through Connie's voice, is sort of representative of Kiwi politics, right? Of sort of these dichotomies within a generalized New Zealand approach to politics. So what it says here is, we had more serious discussions also. Our marriage should be one of minds as well as bodies. I told William of the political issues my father and I had often discussed, especially those concerning education and advancement for women, and the need for more immigrants with cultivated backgrounds to act as a leaven in the lumpen colonial population. William was surprised, I think, when during our trip back to Wellington on a very wet day I pressed him for his political manifesto, but in his answer rose to it admirably. Above all, he strives for a society in which talent and industry are recognized and rewarded and not impeded by the outdated conformities and class distinctions of the old country. In essence, I suppose he wishes for others to have the opportunities of which he has taken full advantage. He is not one for much regulation in commerce or life and trusts to character and practical good sense. So again, I think these are really strikingly New Zealand values, right? prizing things like equity and opportunity are significant, right? New Zealand was, I think, the first colony, country. I think it was a colony at the time, but New Zealand was, I think, the first place in the world to extend the vote to women. And so that gesture toward equity is very central to New Zealand politics. It has not always been in all ways, particularly in the country's treatment of the indigenous Maori people. But especially in recent decades, New Zealand has very much embraced a social justice, equity, equality, opportunity ethos. Additionally, the sort of welcoming of immigrants, right? New Zealand is a settler colony, and this is in some ways a problematic one because it is a settler colony, and so it is built on the partial, though not necessarily entirely, dispossession of the Maori. The Maori did a better job at defending themselves and retaining a position within the colony and then the country than, say, indigenous North Americans, Aboriginal Australians, etc., etc. But nonetheless, the Maori were substantially dispossessed. But that sort of welcoming of immigrants, that sort of embrace of let us bring people in and give them opportunities. So those are sort of Connie's values. And then William's values are about like hard work, individualism, making it on your own. There's very sort of frontier mentality that I think is very true of Australia as well, and at least on a sort of ideological perspective is true of the United States and Canada, even though especially in the US we often don't, in fact, embrace those values, which is often a good thing, but and when we do embrace those values, it tends to be in problematic ways, but that's neither here nor there for the purposes of Marshall's novel. But that sort of idea, right, of like anyone who works hard can make it. There are opportunities for individuals to be successful, etc., etc. Again, that seems like a very New Zealand value to me. So we do get these sort of bits and pieces where, yeah, we're developing interesting components of their characters. But again, so much of it is just like diary entries of like reflecting on the stuff that's going on. And one of the things I think that bothers me about that is because we're getting both Connie's and Dougie's perspectives on things, we're often getting reflections on the same events. And I feel like there's not necessarily enough real difference or added material, added interest that it's sort of worth doing that. So at the sort of stylistic level of it as a novel, I didn't really click with it.